Welcome. You passed the first test of the day, which is finding your way down to here from the ballroom up in the older part of the campus center. So my name is Carl Rethmeyer. I'm Dean of the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy here at UAlbany. So welcome to our campus and welcome to the conference. We're really excited about this panel, which is right up one of the alleys that I'm very interested in. This one is titled Stories from the Frontline, Local Government Experiences and Extreme Events. So the challenges facing local governments and communities due to climate change and extreme weather events are vast, they're expanding, and they're also rapidly changing. And public officials are increasingly facing new and complex problems, particularly at the local level. These events challenge local government decision makers across both the pre and the post-disaster preparedness, response, and recovery continuum. So this panel is focused around stories and experiences both from experts who work closely with public officials as well as those who are on the front lines. And additionally, the panel will also seek to identify opportunities for institutions of higher education to help address these challenges in some of the ways that we heard just addressed in the plenary that we just came from. So we have a fantastic set of panelists who will dig into these issues. And from my left, first we have Peter Lopez, the Region 2 Administrator for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Next to him, Janet McCabe, the Director of Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute in the Robert H. McKinney School of Law. Next to her is Peter Adams, Senior Policy Advisor for the New York City Mayor's Office of Resilience. Next to him is Santos Rodriguez, Director of Community Affairs and Strategic Initiatives, Building and Construction Trades Council of Greater New York. And finally, down at the end is Kevin Neary, the Mayor of the Village of Richmondville, New York. So what we agreed beforehand is that each of the panelists will take about 5 to 7 minutes to talk about the issues as they see them. And then we will have a couple of questions that I'm going to address to the panel, and then we want to make sure to have 20 to 30 minutes for people who are attending to also have an opportunity to interact with this panel. So we're really looking forward to that. And with that, let me see, I believe, Pete, you have slides, so let me pull those up, and I invite you to begin the discussion. Sure.
Where would you like me to present it from?
Wherever you feel comfortable.
Yeah, maybe so I can stand and look.
Sure.
See what's the, Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Yes, I believe so.
So with that said, that gives me about 17.6 seconds per slide. So I'll do my best. And again, I'll be joining you with the leadership panel tomorrow morning. But EPA and the federal family have much involved here, and we do have a number of impressions and changes in focus that we'd like to share. I'll try to highlight that as quickly as I can. So just to begin with, I am Pete Lopez. I'm the Regional Administrator for US EPA, which includes states of New York, New Jersey, includes the Caribbean, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and 8 Indian nations. I'll have you keep up with me on the slides, Dave. So in terms of our coverage, so I just want to thank the institution and our sponsors for this event. So this is incredibly important. We're pleased to be sponsors of the event. And again, this is, for me, it's a little bit of a coming home. So I'm an alum from the SUNY system, SUNY Cobblestone, on both my bachelor's and master's from SUNY Albany, some 30 some odd years ago. So time goes quickly. So just as we can, I also want to compliment our colleagues, Marla and Cecilio, for their passion and helping advance this initiative. So just to flash back, back to slide 3, many will remember the impacts of Irene and Lee, and my colleague Kevin Neary, dear friend and neighbor from Schoharie County, will touch more on that, I'm sure, are not far from where we were today, and many understood the devastation, of course, with Sandy to the coast, New York City, and Lower Hudson Valley, and the New Jersey, the metropolitan area. So I had lived through that as a former assemblyman, representing that area, 6 of my counties from states of emergency. And there are many parallels between that engagement, which to me is insightful and instructive as we continue this conversation. As I stepped into my role in Region 2 as the administrator in September 2017, the Caribbean was hit first by Irma, and then the Irma and Maria. I think it was Maria first, and then Irma. Of course, that added devastation. The reverse, right, Irma and Maria. Of course, the issue there for many of us, that this issue was a very personal engagement. I have family both on the island and also in the Eileen and Lee engagement. But what I found is that there are many themes that you heard touched on by the panel this morning that you'll hear captured in my remarks. So just to punctuate, part of the challenge too is also reflecting on who is the community that you're serving. What is the community? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What do we know about their ability to respond? What do we understand about their financial status? What bandwidth do they have? And also understanding issues of cultural differences and distinctions as well as home rule priorities. And so all of those together lend themselves to understanding and engaging in a form that's a little different from what one might call more of a cookie cutter response. And certainly as we move forward, one would say, well, what is the difference or the similarity between Appalachia, which is the area that I served, and Puerto Rico? And it would be two things, primarily. First is the struggle of the local communities to respond, again, back to the bandwidth, the capacity, also being in place, and this is particularly important to emphasize, the issue of trying to respond in place as your homes, your families, your community are impacted, and as many of the providers, the emergency responders, have been personally impacted. In my home community, in Irene and Lee, we had 8 feet of water in my home village. My parents were homeless, my sister homeless, my staff. Many of my colleagues were responding even though they reported to duty, but had no place to lay their heads at night, and the same in Puerto Rico. So I have my team here, so Dave Kleesner with my special projects, Carmen Guerrera, who is our head of our Caribbean division. If you can stand, folks, just to let folks know. And they're going to be working with us. Anahita William with our lab services. We also have Joe Siegel with our ORC, Sandra Kopek with my senior advisor, and also we have Joel Sherigan from headquarters, our senior climate advisor. But for Carmen in particular and her team, being on the ground on the island, trying to respond with all of these things in motion, made the challenge even more compelling. So as we move forward, the piece that made the recovery even more difficult, I'll just focus on the Caribbean right now, was the premise, as many of you know, of the grid. So imagine trying to deal with all these impacts without power for 8 months to a year, in some cases or more. So part of our challenge was to mobilize and to make sure resources were put in place, to make sure emergency power generation, to establish critical systems so that people could live and function and have some relative degree of stability in the midst of a free fall. Just as a quick note, so as we move forward with the transition from response to recovery, there are some very real differences in the federal family of what that engagement is like. So in response, it's almost a paramilitary type of exercise where people come in, you have mission assignments from FEMA, the various federal partners are engaged in different scopes of work, there are budget dollars assigned, and the premise is to restore functionality really as it existed previous, so kind of return to pre-existing status. The response piece, the recovery piece, I found to be a little bit more entrepreneurial and a little free-flowing. And from my standpoint, and we've done this in Region 2, and we're having this conversation nationally, and I have the benefit of serving in the region, but I've also represent the administrator on what's called the Recovery Support Function Leadership Group, which is the federal family in Washington, focusing on the Caribbean as a priority, and talking about policies, program, engagement, resources. So if you can imagine, there's some $40 billion of federal investment looking to be leveraged in the community. So as we do that, part of the challenge is, again, stabilizing community, but also recognizing some of the challenges. One piece that's a couple observations, and again, the tie between Appalachia and Puerto Rico. And so for rural communities and others, environmental justice communities and others who struggle, is that the core of the community and the the more challenged their administration to respond, the slower and more painful the recovery. And so what we're attempting to do in Region 2, and having this conversation with our partners, is to recognize the pre-existing condition of the community in question, and to say, can we find a way to shift and change that more routine engagement and develop supports that are more focused and understanding of the receiving body. So in this engagement, we're focusing on capacity development. How can we strengthen existing systems? And, if you can imagine, talk about pre-existing conditions. So going into Puerto Rico, massive debt, systems that were not functioning properly to begin with, pre-existing condition, and from an environmental standpoint, water and sewer systems that were not meeting standards even before, solid waste management, where they had challenges. So what I've advocated for and what we're trying to consider is how can we use response and recovery funds to be transformative? So really nothing that was meditated or envisioned in the Stafford Act, which again is return in kind, put it back in place. But the piece I've been advocating, and federal families listening, is how can we take those resources and transform systems? So I'll give you a couple examples. So, and all of this has to be done with a sensitivity to local culture, also with an understanding of home rule, because ultimately what we want to do is we want those systems to be sustainable. So when we leave, so sustainability is not just an environmental concept. Sustainability has many applications. It includes cultural sustainability, includes economic sustainability, the ability of other systems to function. So our premise is we don't want to just go in and put things back in kind, because ultimately all of us know it's not a function of if something happens again, it's a function of when. And the question is, do we leave the community stronger, more resilient, more capable when we finish with our engagement than when we first found them, knowing that they're at risk? And I can tell you, and I'm sure Kevin can understand this, when communities are hit, if they're hit again, the first time they're hit, the first premise is, how do we respond? What do I do? How do I rebuild? Again, if they're hit in rapid succession, the next question is, do I stay? Do I reinvest in my community? Do we work to create jobs and promote reinvestment? And so our goal as a federal family, as a state and local community, is how do we take that anxiety away? No one should have to live in fear, but what are we doing to change the framework and try to leverage in a way that leaves them stronger and more resilient? So, just for example, I'll just lay out that one of the aspects, and part of this is collaboration. So often, and I see this in EPA, and coming from a background, I was a local official in Schoharie County, again serving along with Mayor Neary for 15 years. I was also a legislator in New York and staff for some 35 years. I was 6 terms as a member in New York. But what I found working, again, the parallel between Appalachia and Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, is that resources are not readily available. And what I've also found is that there's no one agency that can solve all the issues, let alone even a single project. So ultimately, it requires regulators, other stakeholders, resource providers, local officials, together in a collaborative framework, both from a macro standpoint, but I would even suggest down to a project-by-project engagement, because the ultimate issue is, what's the translation? So again, I'll go back, there's some $40 billion of federal resource to be infused into not just Puerto Rico, but Virgin Islands, which is insolvent. And again, I just want to highlight for this group, I would encourage us all to make this engagement a Caribbean engagement. Puerto Rico, of course, 3.4 million or more souls. Virgin Island, 120,000 or so, but just as needy and struggling just as much. So I would just encourage the group to focus on that. So in terms of collaboration, making sure that is focused, even translating down to a project-by-project basis. So in Puerto Rico, and I'll just hit, Dave, I'm not sure what slide we're on, but just in terms of accomplishments, we collected in response more than 320,000 containers of hazardous materials, including propane tanks, drums, cylinders, electronics. In that same breath, we collected hazardous medical waste from USVI. The challenge was, after we finished collecting it, there was no system in place to dispense with it. So as soon as we collected it, it started to pile up again. And we learned that they needed investment in infrastructure and training to handle that waste sustainably. So again, I would just say to the group, what good is it to go in and fix it when we know that the community after the fact may not be able to maintain the ability to manage that concern moving forward. We assessed wastewater treatment plants, 51 wastewater treatment plants and hundreds of pumping stations. We addressed 237 non-pros water systems. So if you can imagine, in most rural reaches of Puerto Rico, we had water systems that we learned were not even incorporated. So those who understand structure of entities, we're trying to drive FEMA resources, they don't even exist. So if you can imagine, part of our engagement, and I've asked my team to be entrepreneurial, we actually were helping them literally. I'm down to 1 minute.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, so I'm running out of time. So I made halfway through, but I guess what, just in sum, is I look forward to conversation, but our engagement is long-term. We will be with them for years. We welcome the engagement and the power of the universities. We would like to know very much what their projects are. And what I would like to do, moving forward, I spoke to the chancellor, is find some way to plug the institutions into the sector-based planning and implementation that we are doing on the ground with the federal, state, and local communities. Understand your project, understand where you're investing resources, understand where you're leveraging resources, and look for synergy. So much more to say. This is just the beginning. Thank you so much. God bless. 1 minute warning, that's the worst.
So Janet, I'll get your slides up.
Okay.
And actually,
Yeah. Oh, go. There we go. All right, excellent. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I'm from your Midwestern neighbor. It's the great state of Indiana, which my husband refers to as the gateway to the square states. So I'm the one non-community person, well, or governmental person. I'm the one academic person on this panel, and that's odd for me because I've spent my entire career in government, actually in state government in Indiana. I was at the US EPA for 7.5 years. And now I'm back in Indiana. And I'm working with this, this new institute at Indiana University that was put together a couple of years ago specifically to address resilience and climate change in the state of Indiana. So I'm going to tell you about it. We don't have hurricanes there in Indiana yet, or sea level rise yet. But we do have the impacts of climate change. We have massive flooding, as you guys have read about. We also have changes in species. This is the Karner blue butterfly, which is only found in this little tiny pocket of northwest Indiana and southeast Michigan. And it's getting too warm for it there. So we're going to lose the Karner blue butterfly. We have drought in Indiana. The drought of 2012 is still talked about by farmers in Indiana. This summer, the big news was lake levels were rising. And the communities along the lakeshore, which we have a little bit of in Indiana, depend hugely on tourism and recreation. And those beaches getting smaller is a problem. We're losing species. We're also gaining species. Who would have thought that there would be armadillos in Indiana? There are armadillos in Indiana. I don't find this particularly appealing. They're mostly found in the form of roadkill, but moving north. So, as I said, 2 years ago, President McRobbie announced that the term Grand Challenges was used early this morning. This was part of one of his 3 grand challenges to celebrate the bicentennial of Indiana University. You don't need to read all these words, but the point is that we are dealing with climate change, with environmental change in Indiana, and the point of this grand challenge was not to get into partisan or polarized arguments about whose fault it is, but to recognize that indeed these things are happening, and what can the university do as an obligation back to the state to help communities in Indiana become more resilient. The Grand Challenge had 3 main pillars. Accurate predictions. People need to understand what's coming. feasible solutions. There need to be actual things that people can do that are realistic and achievable, and you need to communicate effectively about it, because if Hoosiers are not hearing about these issues on their local radio station, in their local paper, it's hard to blame them for not really appreciating what's going on. And that communication has to be accurate information, and also from people and through mechanisms that speak to them. The add-on to the Grand Challenge was kind of me, which is to bring an implementation piece. So with all due respect and admiration to my new community of academics, not so much in the real world sometimes, academics. And with all the goodwill in the world, it seemed like this effort would be more impactful if there were an element of it that actually was focused on implementation and getting out into the communities. We benefited in Indiana by starting from this incredible resource, the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, which is a project coordinated by the Purdue University Climate Research Center, but it involves scientists from all the academic institutions in Indiana. And it is a multi-chapter, very comprehensive, peer-reviewed report on climate change. What is climate change going to do in Indiana? Obviously not definitive, because we're always learning more and more. But this was prompted by 10 years ago, when then Senator Richard Lugar went to these guys at Purdue and said, I may have to vote on the Waxman-Markey bill, and I don't know what the impacts on Indiana of climate change are. Can you tell me? Well, isn't that great? And they said, of course we can. And he said, great, I need something in 3 weeks. So they put something together that looked like a high school term paper, but at that time they decided Hoosiers need to have this kind of information. So it's incredible. I commend it to you. I know it's about Indiana and not about New York or Puerto Rico, but in terms of an approach to providing good information for people, it's great. So the elements of the Grand Challenge from the university's perspective were, let's hire some new faculty to fill in gaps. It's a very interdisciplinary approach. The faculty hires are arguably the longest legacy of the Grand Challenge, because they will stay forever. And you hope, academic freedom and all that, you hope they will be interested in pursuing interdisciplinary research on topics that are highly relevant to resilience in Indiana. Research also, and research fellows. Policy and implementation activities, I'll talk about those more in a minute. Communication and communication research. And then the creation of something called the Environmental Resilience Institute, which is both a physical place, but is also a way of thinking. So IU now has a focal point for interdisciplinary work focused on resilience out in the community. My part, until I became director, was really these implementation activities, and I'll highlight a couple of them, but we've been very focused on actually developing things that communities can use. The first one we developed is the Environmental Resilience Institute Toolkit, or ERIC. This is based off of US EPA's ARC-X website that you may be familiar with. Joel and I were colleagues when I was at EPA, a great admirer of ARC-X. And so when I got to IU, I thought, well, maybe we can partner with EPA and do a deep dive on the Midwest. That will look just like ARC-X, and we'll put it on the IU server, and we'll keep it safe and curate it. And so it was a great partnership. Joel worked with us to do this. So we've turned it into an IU Midwest version of ARC-X. And as you can see, we have a continual process of developing case studies that reflect actual things that actual communities in Indiana or the Midwest have done. And with all due respect to my coastal colleagues and my colleagues in great big cities, the things that Miami and New York and Portland, Oregon are doing are just not helpful to the mayor of Kokomo, Indiana. Just not helpful. The mayor of Kokomo, Indiana wants to see what other Midwestern communities are doing, especially small to mid-sized cities. So that's what ERIT is all about, and Joel is working with other universities and organizations that want to create their own regional version of this, and we're thrilled to work with anybody who wants to do that. Glad to talk to you about how we did it. The other one I want to tell you about is one we just released, which is called the Hoosier Resilience Index. This took a lot of that information from our climate change impacts assessment and has created a two-part tool. So every city, incorporated city, town, and county in Indiana can go, and anybody can go on this website and find projections for increased heat and increased extreme precipitation and flooding for their community. I'm really staggered what universities can do, actually. It's really impressive. But then part two is a voluntary, do-it-yourself, walk through a series of questions to see, for the things that are of concern to your community, how resilient are you? So let me just give you an example. Here are some heat maps that show current heat in Indiana, and then for medium emissions and a high level emissions, how much hotter it's going to get. You can see why armadillos are enjoying southern Indiana. It's getting pretty warm there. Part two is this do-it-yourself thing. So we've divided 8 topic areas out. If you are in an area that doesn't have a river, you've got no floodplains, you won't get any questions that relate to flooding and rivers, but you will get questions about extreme heat and that sort of thing. And so it's if anybody's familiar with Second Nature, which is a resilience program for universities, it looks at an individual area, and let's say for heat, you're going to have more heat waves, you need cooling centers probably, right? So you get to check off between, oh my gosh, we haven't even thought about that, to we are all over this. We have cooling centers. We know who needs to get to them. We have a way to call them. We have a way to get them there. Everybody knows what their job is. We review this every year. We're all over it. Thank you. And so you get 5 points for that. And you can sort of self-assess. You can set yourself a baseline. You can see in between 0 and 5 the things you need to do to be more resilient. Another program that we run out of the Institute is this incredibly successful sustainability externship program where we put undergraduates or graduate students in local communities or other organizations for 10 weeks in the summer to work on a sustainability project of that entity's choosing. I have rarely seen a program that's been so universally acclaimed by both sides, the students and the placements. Last year, we had 14 local governments in Indiana, mind you, Indiana, do greenhouse gas inventories that we coordinated. Really incredible first step. And some communities where climate change is not something that people talk about in polite company. I wanted to mention a couple of our communication tools. We support actual environmental reporting at Indiana Public Radio. So this is the reporter that we support. We support 2 other journalists who produce something called the Indiana Environmental Reporter, which is, again, independent journalism, sort of like an AP resource available to any media outlet in the state of Indiana. So little daily papers, weekly papers can't afford to have environmental specialists. They can pick up stories from the Indiana Environmental Reporter. And we just started a podcast called In This Climate. I do not listen to podcasts, but this one is really fun. I'm part of the on-air talent. So I encourage you to dial in. It is not focused just on Indiana. It's on all kinds of stories. If you don't count the communication, which is statewide, these are the counties that we have touched with Indiana University's Grand Challenge. And I'm so proud of it, and there's so much more to do. And we want to make sure that we're sharing what we've done here. Our motto is, don't reinvent any wheels. If you're thinking about doing something that we've already done, we will give you our wheels, and we will take wheels from other people. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the rest of it.
Peter.
Great, thank you. Really interesting to hear about the work that's going on in Indiana. My grandma lives in southern Indiana. She hates the high heat, so I'm glad that you're keeping an eye out for it. But yeah, my name's Peter Adams. I'm from the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. I don't have slides, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of an update today on the work that we've been doing post-Sandy and beyond. I work in the Office of Resiliency, where we coordinate policy citywide focused on addressing climate hazards. We work with a lot of agencies all over the city who each have a piece of the pie. It's a very big cooperative set of projects that I look forward to talking more about. And a lot of the work we're doing right now is focused on Hurricane Sandy. It's been 7 years. It affected New York City, the surrounding area, much of the Jersey coast really severely. It was a major event. It was really our seminal event, that driving event which brought so much more focus, attention, money to the question of resiliency, to the question of how a city can recover, respond, build back stronger. And a lot of cities, pretty much all of us here, many of us have that event that has focused so much public and political attention on these big questions. And Sandy certainly was that for us. It kicked off an enormous recovery program. 7 years in, we've accomplished a lot. There's still a lot more to do. We've raised about 5,000 single-family homes in the outer boroughs. Folks who wanted to continue to stay where they were and had experienced a lot of damage, we elevated their homes. We have undertaken and implemented all types of interim, short-term flood resiliency measures to protect neighborhoods at highest risk. We've done a lot of studies to understand which other neighborhoods might have been at risk had the storm come from a different angle. We've also supported a state buyout program. One community in Staten Island took the state government up on their option to accept buyouts. And so about 300 homes in a coastal neighborhood are now gone, and there are fields there, and they're becoming part of a wetland system that we have, and some are going to be given over to sports activities. But a neighborhood retreated, something which was, I think, a momentous event, but something we're still learning from too, as we understand how best to respond to extreme weather. So a lot's been done. We're still doing a lot. We are working with the U.S. Army Corps as a stakeholder in their harbors and tributaries study, where they're exploring the potential benefits and costs of enormous floodgate protection systems that would keep out storm surge from entering the harbor. There's a lot of ways we might do that. It's just a study, but it's multi-year, it has a lot of stakeholders in the room, and it's an important question. Is this an effective way to address climate risk in our city, to address major storms? We're undertaking other studies within the city. We just started off the master plan for Lower Manhattan, which is going to build on some previous work which showed that it was really hard to build a flood protection system at the current water's edge. So we might need to build into the water. We haven't done that in Manhattan for a few decades, not since Battery Park City. That would be a huge undertaking. And there are some voices before, there's voices with more concerns. We're gonna do a study and try to figure out what makes sense. But that could fundamentally change the shape of Manhattan going forward. It could meet other goals we have, like providing more housing, more green space in that neighborhood, while also protecting that critical part of our nation's financial capital. So there's a lot, and Sandy is the focus of much of it. But Sandy wasn't the beginning of our work on resiliency, and it can't be the end, and that's a big part of our job.